when you review an album, like an album is usually like 1 hour. Because it's only an hour long, you can probably listen to it 40, 50 times even before your review is actually due. That's significantly lower as a time and labor investment than getting a game like Skyrim and being like, okay, I'm going to have to try to just like sprint through this for the next like 100 hours and like see what I can come up with essentially.
This is the Humans of Gaming podcast, an open and honest conversation about games, life, and belief.
Hey, this is Drew Dixon from Love Thy Nerd. I'm the chief content nerd at Love Thy Nerd, and I'm going to figure out a way to say Love Thy Nerd one more time. Love Thy Nerd. Joined with me today is...
extreme product placement.
Yeah. Did I mention that I work with Love Thy Nerd?
Yeah.
Chris Gwaltney is here with me, who happens to be the chief executive nerd at Love Thy Nerd. Hey, Chris.
Love Thy Nerd.
For...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, this is the Humans of Gaming podcast. Welcome. And we know, you have lots of ways to spend your time, and we're just glad you wanted to spend it listening to us talk about Love Thy Nerd. No, this is a podcast where we find people in the gaming industry, whether video games, board games, otherwise, and we just try to get to know them as people. You know, there's so much content out there. There's so many games being played, and it's really easy to forget about the humans behind these games that we consume at an alarming rate. And we just want to be reminded that there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into these things, and just want to appreciate those folks and get to know them as people. So that's why you're here. And we had a really interesting chat that Drew will start telling you about.
Yeah, so we chatted with Yannick LeJacq. I had to practice that before to say Yannick, because every time I see Yannick, I want to say Yannick.
Yeah.
Even though
that's because not. You're because I want to say Yannick too, but that's because I'm from Indiana, and that's just kind of like our we just want to do that kind of thing, you know?
Yeah. There's I don't know if he's famous, but there's a hockey player that's named Yannick, and it's actually pronounced Yannick. And so I'm
I just think of Yanni.
That's part of it.
Yanni.
But Yannick and I go way back to the early 2010s, I guess, when we sort of connected over games writing. We were both writing about games for some of the same websites, I want to say. And he's just a phenomenal games writer. He worked full-time as a full-time editor for Kotaku for several years. Was written for the Wall Street Journal and you name it, gaming sites. He's probably written for them at some point. And he transitioned from working for Kotaku to being a full-time writer for Blizzard. So I don't know if you've heard of that company, but they've made a couple small games like World of Warcraft and StarCraft and Overwatch. So he got to write for them, and that's a pretty hard gig to land. So obviously Yannick is super, super talented and super thoughtful guy. And also he's your hernia bro, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, this is wild. I've been dealing with these 2 hernias for the last several weeks, and come to find out he also has 2 hernias, and we are getting surgery on the same day, which is just freaking wild. So yeah, we're hernia bros now. But man, this was such a cool conversation, and honestly, it's long, guys. It's a long one, and but I think it's worth it. It's all super interesting stuff. He peels back the curtain in a lot of ways on some just kind of inner workings and things that, the normal casual everyday gamer like us won't know about, games journalism and the games industry. Yeah. I think we honestly, in the whole time, maybe asked 3 questions. He just talked, man. He was just he came ready, I think, to just share and bear it all. So I think it was really we're pretty privileged to get to hear from him in this way and get to hear all that stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think like there's a lot of people out there who think, how cool would it be to write about games for a living, or to write for games? You know, to write like lore or to write storylines for various video games. And I know there's a time when I thought that would be like the ultimate job, but man, it's a hard field to get into. And so if you're curious about that, I don't know that this would necessarily encourage you.
Yeah. Hope he doesn't tread on your dreams too much.
No, but I do think it's important to realize like how wild the world of writing about games and writing for game studios is, how competitive it is, and just, I mean, while at the same time, games are freaking cool. They're amazing, and I'm glad I get to play them and write about them and enjoy them. But
well, if nothing else, this conversation was another really great reminder of the whole thrust of our podcast, which is like, hey, this is a human experience of the game industry. And, you know, I think it hopefully creates empathy in us for our fellow person, to better understand them and to more appreciate the work that goes into these things that we enjoy so much. So
yeah, for sure. And also, Yannick mentions it at the end of the episode, but just want to take a minute and plug, like, he's had a horrific go of things with regard to his health costs, like the cost of his health care. And so we're going to put a link to his GoFundMe page. So if you hear this podcast and you're like, man, you know what? I haven't spent all my Christmas money or whatever. Or hey, you know, I just got a little bonus at work. Or if you just say, hey, I've got $20 to give.
Hey, we all just got those Trump bucks. So, yeah.
That's right. If you haven't spent your stimulus money, throw some Yannick's way, and that would really help him, because he's deep into it, deep into trying to pay for some relief to.
Hey, it's a great way to love thy nerd. You just need to find another way to say that.
That's right. All right. Without further ado, here's our conversation with Yannick LeJacq.
Enjoy.
Video games, especially free-to-play games, but also like free-to-play games kind of took a lot of these lessons from places like Nintendo originally, where you kind of put arbitrary obstacles up at different points to kind of stop a person's progress. And those obstacles, especially in free-to-play games, are how you then monetize the game. So it's like, okay, you played like 20 minutes, now you have to spend money if you want to keep playing. Or, you know, in Super Mario World or whatever, it's like, okay, you got to the end of the world, but now you need 10 stars and you only have 8. So you have to go back and you have to replay to get another 2 stars. Or I'm probably getting the currency wrong there. But, it was really horrifying, because I was realizing like this whole system is operating on a very similar mindset, where it's like there's all these arbitrary points where it's like, well, no, you can't get the surgery yet because you have to have another meeting with another specialist, and then you have to get a note of approval from that specialist to then get approved for this. And like they kept denying, like they kept refusing to kind of like accelerate or appoint or schedule the surgery. But then it was also this question of like, okay, if you can't do that, then you have to at least provide me with something in terms of like a pain management solution, because you're a doctor and I'm telling you that I have a health problem and you're not helping me with it. And that became this whole other thing of like, you're only allowed to be approved for a pain management specialist if you've officially met with all these different experts who rule out, they have to all agree unanimously that they can't find a cause for your pain. So I had to have all these other meetings just before I could even meet with a pain specialist. And then that was really hilarious, because then I got into the pain specialist and I was describing my symptoms and the pain specialist was like, I don't understand why your surgeon is so convinced that the hernias aren't the cause of the pain, because this really just sounds like your hernias are causing you pain. And I was like, oh, you gotta be kidding me. But it's similar to me, or it seems similar in that way, that it's like they put all these barriers up, and a lot of these barriers don't exist they don't exist in healthcare for the purpose of actually meeting or responding to human need. They exist because insurance companies and hospital networks have collaborated to install them to be like, if we put these barriers here, and this is the part that gets really scary to me because I don't know how intentional this is, but it's like, if you put these barriers here, one, people are going to have to pay for more stuff, and insurance companies are going to be able to bill hospitals more. And then,
Yep.
like, you have all these like required consultant meetings where like I've had like three different meetings with this surgeon where it's literally like I would call them and be like, why do I have to have another meeting? And they're like, the surgeon needs to examine you before he can decide blah blah blah. And then the surgeon would literally walk into the room and be like, okay, and then turn back around and walk out. So I'm like, clearly the meeting isn't actually required by anything other than this bureaucracy that's enabling it. And the part that's scary to me is that it seems like at some points it's like the idea is kind of maximizing pain and human suffering is a way to kind of accelerate that and put people, if you think about it in gamification terms, it puts them in a place where they're psychologically primed to be willing to pay these astronomical costs for their
Mm.
for their healthcare, just because like, if you think of where I was when I paid that $1,500 bill for my colonoscopy, which is relatively
That you
small in
didn't
terms
really
of
need.
bills, right?
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
that was this whole thing that I won't get into, but it took me like the Cleveland Clinic, the hospital network I've been working with, they kept messing up different things before that meeting was supposed to take place. And especially during COVID, you have to follow this very strict regimen. Like I had to get a COVID test by a certain date. I had to have the results of it by a certain date. I had to have I had to take this gigantic jug of some laxative by a certain date. And they just kept messing things up. And then it would take me like sometimes 8 to 12 hours at a time to fix their mistake just to make sure that the appointment still happened.
Mm.
And then finally, when I like showed up for the appointment itself, they gave me the actual price tag, which is another thing that feels very like video gamey or kind of modern technology app like to me,
That's the
because
thing
it's
that
like
drives
you
me
conceal
nuts
the real
about.
cost,
Yeah. That drives me nuts about our healthcare system. I live in Tennessee, but that's, we've had 2 children here in the state of Tennessee,
Oh god,
and it's
yeah,
just
having
insane.
children must be so.
It's so expensive, and they don't tell you. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to like talk like real numbers either. They're just like, oh, don't worry about it. Like, and you can't. They're not even really very upfront about the payment plans and stuff like you talked about before.
Yeah.
Like, you really have to dig to discover that those are things you can do.
Yeah.
Which is very not like pro health, like the health of human beings.
Try not having insurance. So my wife and I, we just got insurance within the last year, and I'm 34 and she's 29. So I mean, the first 10 years of our marriage, like we didn't have insurance, and so we would just go and pay cash, like for things that we needed to do. And she has like a prescription that she needs for her thyroid. But dude, like when you walk in and they say, oh, let me have your insurance thing. Like, we don't have insurance. We're just going to pay cash. It's just like they short circuit. They have no idea what to do or how to tell you like, oh, it's this much or that. Like, and when you're paying cash, you need to know those things. Cause like, we can't just go to this appointment if it's going to bankrupt us. Like, we need to know how much it is. And dude, it was always a runaround anytime we wanted to figure that out.
In a not the same boat, but slightly similar in some ways, in the sense that like we've always had a high deductible plan for the last several years, for the reason of like we have a health savings account that we're pretty like committed to like saving for things in, and it's just a decision we wanted to make. Wanted more income as opposed to paying more for insurance. But that, because our deductible is so high, I always want to know what things cost. And it's I had a much less serious health issue a few months ago where I just had horrible abdominal pain, and went to a doctor. The doctor was like, hey, if this doesn't go away after, they were like, we're pretty sure it's just a stomach virus. and if it gets any worse, go to the ER. So I listened to that advice, and I went to the ER. Yeah, I went to the ER, and it was horribly expensive, and they had no help for me. Like zero, I didn't get any help at all.
That's the other thing, because like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh no, I mean, just it turned out it probably was just a bad stomach virus, and some really bad, like, it's probably more information than anyone needs, but just some bad constipation that was making the stomach virus worse. So
Drew couldn't poop.
You know what you need to try for constipation? I've been using, one of my friends got me some Epsom salt, because like one of the only things that has helped a lot with pain relief has been taking baths, and Epsom salt is like one of the most valuable commodities in my life right now. Like if it was I don't know, some resource management sim, it would be like probably one of the most valuable things in my roster, because one, it works as
video
that,
game terms
but then
for
it's
us.
also like a super strong laxative. And I think, I don't, in my experience, because I had a lot of that when at the beginning of this, I was briefly given very like 2-day prescriptions to Tylenol 3 a couple times, and Tylenol 3 is the kind of like, it's treated like this massively controlled substance, especially in Ohio, but in more advanced countries it's just sold over the counter because they're not as horrible as us. But it's considered like bad and scary because it's the first level of Tylenol that has codeine in it. And I took that, but then like speaking of the ER, the thing that's really messed up about drug laws in Ohio for these kind of anti-opioid measures is the only place you can go to even get prescriptions for Tylenol 3, let alone like actual powerful opioids like, like Oxycontin or Vicodin or something, is the ER. So that's what's really messed up, is it kind of forces people into this position, especially if they're actually in serious, like, incapacitating levels of pain, or they're just genuinely addicted to opioids. It forces them into this position where they're like, okay, I can either go to the ER over and over again, like go visit multiple ERs in the area I live in, because if you go to one ER routinely, they're going to stop believing you, obviously. Like I can go there and I can pay like $600 to $2,000 a pop to get a 2-day supply of Vicodin, or I can go buy heroin for like $20 on the street somewhere, And that's like, that core dynamic in and of itself is one of the really awful parts of this whole kind of anti-opioid laws, I think, because it so clearly incentivizes people to go kind of find illegal opioids, which are obviously super dangerous. But I was saying that because after that I tried kratom for a little while, which is disgusting, but kind of helped me for a little bit, thankfully. But opioids and kratom both cause a lot of constipation, which, when you have something like a hernia, constipation can actually cause hernias or be one of the kind of factors of them in the first place. But then if you already have one and you're really constipated, it can be
don't push too hard.
Yeah. So I was trying a bunch of over-the-counter laxatives, and then finally I went to Epsom salt, and that was like the scorched earth policy. It just like, it was the one that just cleared me out entirely, but it was not a fun or enjoyable process when I did it. But if you have that problem again, I'd say try Epsom salt, because it's
Epsom salt.
It's like the
that's good
nuclear
to know.
grade one.
Yeah. I don't wish that pain on anyone, for sure. It was no joke, and I didn't have hernias to amplify the pain. But
wait, Chris, that's
welcome
hilarious.
to the.
I'm going to get my surgery on the 6th too, so we should
oh, dude,
lend each other more.
That is like,
support.
yeah.
Yeah.
I've never gone under for anything before, like anesthesia.
Oh, really?
So it's like my first time having any kind of anything. The surgeon did tell me though that they may have a robot do my surgery.
What?
So maybe I'll like come out the other side with some powers.
Better
He
not
was
to know.
honestly like, I'm a pretty relaxed, like kind of go with the flow person. I don't get super stressed out in a lot of scenarios, but like this surgeon, I would think with like other people, like, well, let's take my wife, for instance, like he would not have instilled any amount of confidence in most people the way this surgeon, like he was just so nonchalant, and like the way he just casually slipped into conversation that I have 2 hernias instead of 1, the fact that, you know, a robot will be doing my surgery instead of a human person with a human brain.
Was he like, I might do it, but maybe I'll just have my robot do it.
I'll
Depends.
just
have my robot.
I'm just gonna have.
Depends on if I get
C3PO do your surgery.
Depends on if I knock out those 18 holes in time.
Yeah, totally. He was like the most chill bro, which is not something you really want from a surgeon.
Yeah, I mean, I guess chill could be okay, but like it's good.
There's a certain level though. There's like a threshold of
for sure.
chill.
Cavalier, more like like, hey, you know, fun fact, you have 2 hernias, not 1 hernia.
Yeah.
Do you get to meet the robot beforehand?
I don't know. It's going to be 5:30 a.m., so I'll barely be coherent.
Oh, you got to see. I didn't even get to schedule mine in advance. They call me the day beforehand to let me know, because I guess that's the way the Cleveland Clinic OR works. Which makes sense. Like they kind of, I guess they leave at least elective surgeries open because if more emergency cases pop up or something. But I'm supposed to wait until the day before to get the call to be like, okay, here's when it's going to go
Here's
down.
the time.
Yeah.
I think we kind of mentioned this via email, but we'll probably go, like, one of the things we always ask people is like about your background, your upbringing. So we might talk a little bit about religion and stuff, but always out of a desire to just hear from you and where you come from. And we just want you to feel like comfortable to be you and be honest, and there's no right or wrong answers, and we may occasionally contrast what we think about something from what you think, but never out of a desire to be like, you're wrong and here's why. So we don't want to feel like a debate ever. I don't think it really, honestly, like in all the recordings we've done of this, it's never felt that way. So anyway, just kind of as a disclaimer.
Well, hey, there's a first time for everything. So
hey, that's right.
That's good, because I hate religion. No.
Great.
Perfect.
I can't wait.
Let's get into it.
I don't hate religion. I don't know how I'm one of those Jews in terms of my background that like was raised Jewish and I had a bar mitzvah, but I'm like definitely not I'm definitely not like observant in the sense of like I don't really believe in the kind of Old Testament God. And even if I did, like I think the Old Testament God is a kind of messed up figure in a lot of ways. Like he just kind of does a lot of stuff that I haven't read it in a long time, granted, but like stuff that to me seemed very
there's some scary stuff,
spiteful, or just like if you didn't like the Jews being slaves, couldn't you have just like stopped them from being slaves in the first place rather than like making them wander the desert and like go through all these awful, painful things to you know, whatever.
What up, nerd? Thank you for listening to this podcast from the Love Thy Nerd Podcast Network. We hope you're enjoying it. But hey, did you know that Love Thy Nerd airs almost all of its podcasts first on LTN Radio? That's right. LTN Radio is your home for the best Christian rock, rap, pop, and indie music. And it's also the place to go to hear Love Thy Nerd's content before it reaches the podcast feed. In addition to that, Love Thy Nerd creates a lot of content that's exclusive to LTN Radio that you're missing out on. So go check out ltnonair.com and listen for yourself. You can also download the Live 365 app on your smartphone and search and favorite LTN Radio, or enable the LTN Radio skill on your Echo devices and simply ask Alexa to play Love Thy Nerd. Now let's get you back to that podcast.
But that's like, I don't know. I think a lot of Judaism for me, especially at this point, is more about the kind of like, it's more about the kind of culture and the tradition and the sort of kind of resilience of the Jewish people, which I find very inspiring. And like I've connected a lot with I remember this is really, I started online dating a couple months ago too for the very first time, which hasn't always coincided well with suddenly having these very
Post
painful
hernias, huh?
and stuff. Yeah.
Post
That's
hernias is probably
that's a
not a great
decision,
time for like starting your
Yeah.
profile or
I
whatever.
yeah. I didn't even I more started it because I don't know like anyone in Ohio, and the only people I did know once I got here were my classmates, and
Yeah.
my classmates are cool, but a lot of them are like much younger than me. They're like right out of college. I'm 31. And I got in like a kind of argument with one of my classmates at one point that wasn't super bad or anything, thankfully, but it made me realize like, oh, I should like be looking other places than this Zoom based class environment for like friends and social support in this new place that I live.
Yeah.
And I remember I like put that I was Jewish on my profile, and I'm really interested to talk to more of my friends who live in other places, because Ohio is like also one of the most kind of conservative places I've ever lived, certainly. I mean, there was before the election like Trump and MAGA signs like everywhere, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then when I started the dating stuff, which again, like I don't have a ton to compare it to, but I would go
But
on
it ultimately
Tinder.
didn't Ohio ultimately go for Biden, so it's kind of like a
They
mixed state, isn't it?
did
Or it's a
it.
battleground state. I always think of it that way. Anyway.
Um, but like, a lot of the profiles I was being introduced to were these like very religious, very Christian people. A lot of people who
Mhm.
like either are in the army or they used to be in the army, and they're posing with these like giant guns, and they're like, you know,
Uh-huh.
if you're like a communist, I'm gonna shoot you, kind of stuff. But then some people, Cleveland, where I live specifically, has always had a very kind of historically large Eastern European population. So there's always been a kind of big Jewish kind of settlement in this area, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I remember this one Jewish person who matched with me started messaging me and was like going like, I don't know what you'd call it, just like, she's obviously very religious, and she was like, oh, Shabbat Shalom, like, what are you doing for this, what are you doing for that, and then like asking me what temple I was going to join. And I said to her, I was like, I'm not really Jewish in that way, but like, um like, I've always loved, like, I have a really strong admiration for like a ton of Jewish writers and Jewish artists and Jewish philosophers. So that was what I said to her. I was like, I'm not like super Jewish right now, but like, it's been a big part of my personal history, and like I've always like really looked up to like Levinas as like the best, continental philosopher of his day. Levinas was a Jew who he was like, he's like like I think of him in some ways as the sort of like philosopher equivalent of someone like BJ Blazkowicz, because he like literally he wrote one of his philosophical treaties, I don't know what the plural is, by hand
Things.
when he was in a German POW camp during World War II. And his big thing was that he was like originally a kind of fan of Martin Heidegger, who's like probably the most famous and influential philosopher from that time. And Martin Heidegger ended up being a Nazi. So his whole philosophy about kind of like alienation and being and Dasein and all those other things he talks about, like at a certain point in his philosophical development, he just came to see the good things as the things that the Third Reich embodied, and the bad things as the things that the Jews embodied. And Levinas was one of the first philosophers who really kind of like took him on in philosophical terms that I barely understand, because that language is so obtuse and complicated. But I always thought that was really cool. And I like personally, like, I don't know, I really connected with a lot of his philosophy when I read it in college. So but it was just
how
like,
did she respond to that?
that person did not like, she didn't she just said like, oh, I've never heard of Levinas, that sounds interesting. And then we never talked again. But
You just summed up online dating.
yeah.
Yeah, that's probably true.
But my other kind of main exposure to religion was or I don't even know what to call it, and it's fucking like I don't even know if it's a beef with religion as much as with the 12 steps, but I started doing 12-step work and like going to the meetings and doing that whole thing, working the program as they call it when you're in the
Yeah.
program when I was in
Mhm.
California. And it I did it for like a long time, and like doing those kinds of things, if you do them the way that, well, you can't really generalize because every 12-step meeting, let alone every kind of local community, is so different from one another. But
Mm-hmm.
if you do it kind of by the book, the way that I think most people in all the places I've been to meetings do it, you spend a lot of time because you have to go to like 3 to 4 meetings a week, which is already like 3 to 4 hours,
I
or
mean,
even as much as
there's
five or
yeah, a
six.
few things that I do 3 or 4 times a week.
Yeah. And then, you have a sponsor, and usually a sponsor, like, you have to call them every day, sometimes multiple times every day. And then you have to, like, doing the actual 12 steps itself is like, a lot of that stuff is actually the part that I find the most useful or found the most powerful about it, because a lot of it is just like personal reflection and writing. And then
Mm-hmm.
you
Mhm.
kind of like pass it by your sponsor as like the person who's kind of holding you accountable for it. But
Yeah.
But then I was in OA. I originally tried to join Overeaters Anonymous, and the problem with OA is that's such a small program and there's so few men in it that I wasn't able to find a sponsor until I found this old woman who was very, very nice. Because like there's a lot of kind of gender politics are very, very traditional in my experience in 12-step programs. Like men and women aren't usually very comfortable sponsoring one another.
Mhm.
But I found this one woman who was very nice and she was willing to sponsor me. But she's like she's one of those kind of what they call old timers, where like she's been in AA and OA for like probably 30, 40 years at this point, and
Wow.
is just talking all about God and gratitude the whole time. So
Yeah.
she was only willing to sponsor me if I also joined AA, which I was open to doing at the time because like drinking wasn't it was something that I like didn't really enjoy anymore, but it was also something that I could tell like was problematic at points.
Mhm.
In your
Um
past.
right. So then
Right.
if you do two 12-step programs simultaneously, that's basically like all you have time for outside of work during a week, you know? Um
Yeah. You have a very busy life at that point.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's basically like I was thinking about that actually in terms of like this video game stuff too, because like one of the big challenges with video games that I think made working in the game industry unsustainable for me is that to be really like enmeshed and immersed in the game industry and kind of like up to speed on everything, for me at least, like I just had to be playing video games constantly. Like that was all I ever did
Yeah.
outside of work and on the weekends and everything. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember like when I was at Kotaku, I remember one of my bosses at one point mentioned that because we had it was actually really funny. They instituted this kind of policy at one point when I was there, and I know that they've tried this again in a slightly different way since then. I remember seeing on Twitter that Stephen, the EIC, kind of said that they were going to be doing this a different way. But to his credit, one of the things that Stephen Totillo, the EIC, as a manager, was trying to do, even when I was there, was that I think he was trying to acknowledge the sheer amount of labor and time commitment involved when you review a video game.
Oh
Because if you
gosh.
review
Yeah.
Mhm.
like a
Mm-hmm.
big open world video game, it takes like, like if you try to like,
You
whenever
try to
I
beat
reviewed a
it.
big video
Like if you
game, it
try
was
to
like,
beat something like
yeah,
I don't know, like Dragon Age or something. That's a mammoth task, you know?
right,
Mhm.
or The Witcher 3, or like one of the, like
Yeah.
especially games that have like big self-contained side quests and things that are like
Mm-hmm.
sometimes more interesting and more valuable than the main plot is, or like Skyrim. Like, I have no idea how people reviewed Skyrim. That was like, I was
Yeah.
just starting out in games journalism when Skyrim came out, and I remember seeing, I think it was Giant Bomb. One of the ways that they kind of adapted to it was they literally just had like a series. I think it was either one or like a series of all day streams where they just played the game all day after it came out, and like that was one of the ways they kind of grappled with it.
Yeah.
But like, like Skyrim, like I remember one point when I was at Kotaku, Kotaku, like all the Gawker sites, had like a really, and still has, I'm sure, has like a really vibrant and really active commenting base. And there was some blog that someone did kind of just about like, I think I don't remember the exact subject or nature, but I think it was kind of asking the question of like, how much do you have to play of a game like Skyrim to feel like you've quote unquote finished it? And
Yeah.
then one person in the comments posted a screen cap of their Steam log, and they'd played Skyrim for over 1,000 hours.
Oh gosh.
And I was like, and they were like, "Yep, definitely finished it."
Yeah.
And I was like,
That's when the game beats you,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing, like, too, how how many gamers out there, I think, kind of have that mentality of like, if you're going to review this thing, you need to have experienced
You better
all
put
of
in the
its,
time. Yeah.
all that it has
Right.
to offer, or else you can't give an objective, unbiased opinion or something. And
Right.
I mean, like, in addition to all the, like, I don't know, Gamergate stuff, there's a whole lot of just really like basic level lack of empathy sometimes,
Yeah.
or it can feel that way
Mhm.
amongst gamers about what we expect from people who write about them or review them or whatever.
And it's not even lack of you're totally right, and that's a great point about the kind of audience expectations, because it's like, and especially when you filter in that cultural garbage, I mean, especially like Kotaku.
So I don't know that I ever got, sorry, just to go back, what was Kotaku's policy exactly that tried to give you some
Right,
grace
sorry.
in that area?
So when I was there, what Steven instituted, and I remember this was really funny when he sent this email out, because Steven has a very one of the things I admired about him, but also always found funny on some level too, is he's like a very serious dude. And a lot of kind of journalists and good editors are serious, obviously, but um like, you kind of have to grok the self-evident silliness sometimes of
Yeah.
writing about things like video games with the kind of way that journalists and people like that talk about their work. So
Mhm.
there would be
Yeah.
like, I don't want to get more off topic, sorry, but there was like this really funny, do you guys remember, he wrote this post that I really loved when I was there. The headline is "The Future of Kotaku's Video Game Coverage is in the Present." And
Mm-hmm.
this was actually kind of like the bigger picture sort of rollout of, I think, what his kind of like grand plan or grand vision for Kotaku at the time was. And his policy on how he let us review games was part of that. But so let me just read this one passage of this, because he quotes his own email that he sent to us. He's like, "I described this shift in an email that I sent to the Kotaku staff on June 16th. I can confirm because I got this email. I forgot to read it for a while until someone else told me, like, hey, Stephen sent this big email that we all have to read." But he said, this is the email itself. He says, "The future of games coverage is in the present. For too long, gaming coverage has focused on the vague future, the preview mindset of possibilities and maybes. And when it's involved in the present, it has been drenched in the dreary falseness of empty interviews, bland producer speak, and executive hype. It's neither been real enough nor true enough to do what is actually happening now. For too long, games reporting has involved staring at what is opaque, maybe glimpsing something through it and reporting about that possibility, all the while ignoring so much of what is clearly visible and exciting around us. Then I'll skip down a little bit. He kind of has this whole thing where he talks about the problem with games journalism today, and then he says, this is archaic and an insult to gamers. This is changing at Kotaku as of now. Which I just like, I remember reading that and being like, oh damn, like this guy, like I don't know, I always respected that about him, is like, well, someone has to take this seriously and think about it in these kind of terms for it to work at all, but to go back, so the thing that he did when I was there was he created this policy that he called play days, which I remember we all joked about, because I remember like when he emailed us all about that, someone replied back being like, what are you going to do next? Have us have work days? But the idea with it is like, if you had a big game that you were reviewing, especially if it is one of those kind of Skyrim or Assassin's Creed, even Assassin's Creed isn't as big as Skyrim usually, but like, some kind of mammoth open world game, he would give you had to kind of like request them in advance, but he would give you time during work days, sometimes as much as an entire day or even two, where you could kind of just focus on playing the game as much as possible. And then I can't remember, but I remember seeing like on Twitter, I think a year or two ago, that they kind of changed it in some way where it was more about like, if you reviewed a big game, you could then kind of like take time off the following week or something. And I think both of those are kind of a recognition of the fact that it's just like such a serious, like, I don't know, that's like the thing. I had some like pretty intense and kind of profound moments as a writer working in that framework of, you kind of like get a review copy sent to you, and once you get it in your hands and you're like downloading it on your PS4 or PS3 or whatever, it's kind of this mad sprint of like, okay, I'm going to try to finish this as quickly as possible. And then like, you think as a writer or anybody who's kind of deploying critical and analytical faculties, you want some time to be able to kind of reflect on something before you start writing about it. But you almost never have that time available. So it's just like, you finish it, quote unquote, finish it, whatever finishing it means. And like, as the credits are rolling, you're just like literally starting to like write whatever it is that's going to be your review in like a Google or Word document or something. And for me, I mean, I remember the first time, like, a lot of the time, like, I started writing about games for kind of like mostly non-gaming outlets. So like the places that kind of started to get me noticed was I was writing for, well, actually this was like, I got started officially as an intern at Killscreen magazine when that was still a thing. And then
I remember that, because that was kind of that's your and I's connection, more or less. Not that I ever wrote for, I trying to remember if I wrote for Killscreen, but my very good friend Richard Clark wrote for Killscreen, and you guys connected through Killscreen, and then you and I ended up hanging out at GDC a couple times, and so I remember those days when you were working at Killscreen. Which was like, for our audience, because Killscreen's not around anymore, is it?
I don't think it's the company. I call it the company formerly known as Killscreen. I think they're now called 256, and it's more a kind of like advertising agency that kind of works with brands to sort of you like produce or consult for them for some sort of like gaming content. But
but back in the day, it was kind of like, I don't know, how would you describe it? It's like the Pitchfork or something of the video game world, where it's like they're going to take games seriously. It's in-depth, very very in-depth articles that weren't just about whether games are good or not, but sort of about like, what is their meaning, and what is their meaning in the world as we interact with them, kind of.
And when I was there, they actually literally had a partnership with Pitchfork, where Pitchfork would display, they had a little pane on their website where they would display Killscreen articles. And that, like a lot of things at Killscreen, I think it was like a cool idea, but it was never really kind of like I mean, a place like Killscreen, like a place like Killscreen just suffered from the fact that, like, you have these kind of like small bootstrap operations like that are cool and they're really ambitious, and the idea is like, yeah, we're gonna like look at games and we're gonna talk about them in this more kind of thoughtful and experimental and incisive way. But then like they don't have the money or the budget, and because they don't have that of like the IGNs or the GameSpots, it's like you can't support and hire a staff to do that. So then it always kind of comes down to just relying on, I mean, I think most of the people that
Freelancers.
worked for Killscreen were either games journalists themselves, like Gus Mastrapa, I might be mispronouncing his name right now, but
Yeah.
people like him who were already kind of established and I think wanted to start doing different kinds of writing for their own personal edification, or people like me who had like just graduated college or were still in college even, or like had
Mm-hmm.
other careers and they just kind of like treated it as a hobby basically, because you would
Yeah.
make like, I mean, I think I made like something like 20 or 30 bucks for every individual article I ever wrote for Killscreen,
Oh
which
gosh.
then
As
what
an
I was gonna say
official intern,
before,
right?
yeah, what I was going to say before is one of the ways that Killscreen really helped me was the founder of Killscreen is a kind of, he's like a really interesting and kind of eclectic personality, but he's one of those guys who like he just has lots of ideas, and he's like he kind of is just like always tossing out things, and like they're very ambitious ideas, but I don't think he always kind of thought pragmatically of like, okay, how are these things going to kind of manifest as like concrete successful editorial
Mhm.
products. So like I remember at one point for me, he just asked me kind of, he called me one day and he's like, hey, like I want you to make a photography book about playgrounds all around the world. And I was like, okay, like that sounds amazing, but like
Yeah.
how are you gonna like, like how am I
Pay
gonna do
you.
that and get it at the scale and the funding where I can like travel, like do
Yeah.
like National Geographic level work where I'm like traveling the world taking cool pictures of playgrounds,
That sounds like an awesome job.
I
If
know.
they actually like funded that.
If it's an actual job,
But
yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds
so
great.
the founder, his name's Jamin, he originally worked at the Wall Street Journal, and I think he left to pursue kind of games more singularly, which is why he kind of founded Killscreen and everything, which I think is a
Yeah.
really cool mission and a cool inspiration. And it's I don't I know Killscreen has gotten a bad rap over the years for lots of different reasons at the different kind of phases of its life, but I've always thought that that was like certainly something I could admire, like being at a very
Yeah.
kind of
The idea of it
stodgy
was
and
really
established
cool.
legacy media outlet like the Wall Street Journal, which like,
Mm-hmm.
they're very conservative obviously, and they kind of have a very traditional way of looking at things. So especially when it came to video games, it was like, I think probably when he left, they probably never even talked about them in terms of their entertainment value. It was purely in terms of like, well, Activision made a gajillion dollars with its latest Call of Duty release or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Hmm.
so he had a relationship with this editor at the Wall Street Journal very similar to the Pitchfork one, where this editor would basically ask him, or I think more Ryan, the guy who was working as the main kind of editor of Killscreen at the time, he would email him and be like, hey, like, I heard, you know, the new Fallout's coming out soon or something, for instance, and like that seems like a big game. Why don't like can we get a review of that? So then they had some kind of editorial partnership basically where they would publish Killscreen articles with the kind of Killscreen logo and everything. Um on this Wall Street Journal blog called the Speakeasy, which was their kind of like entertainment and pop culture blog. So and like a lot of things at Killscreen, I mean, like, everyone was overworked and the staff was like two or three people plus like the latest army of interns that they hired to work for free.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, quote
nobody
unquote
really
hired.
maintained that relationship. And I don't remember exactly how it kind of fell on me, but I started getting CC'd on emails between Chris, the Wall Street Journal editor, and the Killscreen editor, and then eventually Chris just started emailing me directly. So then I just started writing stuff completely for him.
Yeah.
not because like it wasn't like I was going around anyone or going behind anyone's back, but it was just like, well, like I was a freelance writer and I was just starting out trying to get
Mm-hmm.
my name out there. So
Mm-hmm.
it was obviously a great opportunity to be able to say I was published in the Wall Street Journal. And
Yeah.
it was, I'm laughing because
I've been there, man. I totally get that.
it was also funny because like, I suddenly got like so much more ingratiated with the video game PR industry because like, they didn't care at all about a place like Killscreen where it's like, we don't,
Mm-hmm.
like if we get reviewed by some like very small niche indie gaming outlet like that doesn't affect our bottom line at all. But if I can tell my boss that I got the Wall Street Journal to cover one of my games, like that's a huge win
Mm-hmm.
for these people. So it was really hilarious because I'd get these emails and I'd get invited to these like exclusive meetings and like,
Yeah.
especially with the kind of like I I'm curious how this works today because I think when I was in the kind of game reporting scene proper, it was sort of like making the first big and I think important transition out of the like really scummy and gross ways that video game PR and marketing used to literally like just buy coverage for their games,
Yep.
or they do stuff like I remember one of the early Assassin's Creed games, they just invited all these journalists to this like tropical resort to like spend a couple days
Yeah.
there. And like the whole purpose of that is just to like get all these people there and get them liquored up and get them to have a
Wine
good
and
time.
dine.
And then it's like, oh, by the way, we have an AC game coming out, so you should like say something nice about it. And that was like part of the deal. But I never like partook in that because I obviously could tell it was inappropriate, and also like I just didn't have time. But I would get these calls from like people and like bigger than the like individual PR rep for a game. It would be like the director, or not the director, but like someone who is like clearly more senior in the kind of PR apparatus. And it was just funny because I think a lot of them had this impression of me as like this like Wall Street Journal, like veteran Wall Street Journal reporter. And like I was just this dipshit who just graduated college, and like I was like interning because I knew I wanted to work in journalism, but like I was working at like a deli for a while. And then after that I got this part-time job at this really fancy high-end restaurant in New York that my friend Georgia worked at, where literally my job was they hired me for a couple weeks just to peel onions because because
Wow.
there was like this certain kind of onion that was in season then, and they just needed someone to spend like hours every day peeling these onions in this specific way
Crying.
because there was just so many of them. So I would like be working for like 5-6 hours just peeling onions with like my eyes burning and everything in the basement of
Mm-hmm.
this restaurant. And then I'd like open my phone, leaving or going on a cigarette break, and I'd get these emails from these people who like clearly thought I was like a more successful journalist than I was at the time. And that always seemed funny to me. But I started talking about that just to illustrate again that it was like when I started writing for the Wall Street Journal, they were paying me $50 a post. So,
That's
like I
crazy.
reviewed
Even, I
a
mean,
couple,
even, yeah, I mean, like with even the Wall Street Journal, it's
Yeah.
right.
amazing how
$50.
people make a living doing this, you know?
Well, right, and if you think about it, like I remember I reviewed GTA 5 for them, and like you can
That's a pretty
definitely
big game
play
too.
GTA 5 for more than 50 hours. So if you
Oh,
think of the
yeah.
sheer hours that you sink into it, and then the hours it takes to actually write something that's good, you're making less than like $1 an hour, which is
Yeah.
just
You should just go back to peeling onions.
I will say video
It'd
games
probably be
clearly
less tears.
prepared me and equipped me with the skills necessary to peel those onions, because like
Yeah.
you need just the capacity to handle incredibly repetitive tasks, which gamers are
And to
uniquely
be able
equipped
to
with.
weep.
Mm-hmm.
But to your point, Drew, like about this thing about how gamers don't respect the kind of commitment and work involved in it, like that's totally true. I think another aspect of that as well, that certainly when I was living in New York and was very like immersed in the kind of like young sort of media folk kind of scene there, like all the like I was never like one of the very cool kids, but I had lots of friends who like worked at Vice or then I worked at Gawker, obviously. So then I worked next to all the people at Gawker and Jezebel and Deadspin who, all have like much bigger Twitter followings than I do. But there's a very pronounced sense that I always felt, and I definitely am not alone in this, that other journalists really don't respect video game journalism either. Like they don't hold it in very high esteem. And I think some of that is because of criticisms that like may be kind of harsh, but certainly aren't illegitimate. Like the idea of like, oh, this is just like you're just writing reviews that are bought and paid for by publishers. And that's obviously true because there's been so many controversies showing that that's the case, But like I remember having an argument with one of my good friends who I met because we were both interns at Killscreen, and then he went to work at Vice for a number of years, but he's no longer kind of dedicated to this beat, but he was like a very, very accomplished and talented music journalist. And I met a lot of other music journalists that worked at Noisy, which is the Vice, or it used to be the Vice music blog. And then Pitchfork, for example, or the Fader, and like all those places are run out of New York. So it's like you kind of, you meet people in that scene and you go to the same parties and you start to talk to all of them. And I remember arguing with, I don't think it was actually with Drew. Drew's the one that I met at Killscreen because he obviously understood this on web level, but it was one of our mutual friends who's another music journalist who kind of always like sort of had these kind of inklings or like implicit kind of wishes that he wanted to try like his hand at games journalism. And I remember saying to him at one point that I was like, look, like a lot of people think of this, and I think the reason why games journalism doesn't get any respect is that it's like you hear people describe these things, or like the way I would complain about like, oh god, I just got this game like 2 days before release, so that means I'm just literally gonna have to play it for 30 hours straight and then write a review. And they'd like think like, well, you're just getting paid to play video games. Like, how is that hard? That sounds amazing, And games in and of themselves, like the way that they're designed and the way they work, like games often are a form of labor in and of themselves. Like, grinding is a thing in video games because grinding is literally working on something. What I said to this music friend of mine is like, look, like when you review an album, like an album is usually like 1 hour, maybe 2 hours long tops. And you can listen to an album while you're doing other things. So you can like listen to it as you're doing all your other tasks during a day. And then because it's only an hour long, you can probably listen to it like 40, 50 times even before like your review is actually due. And that just makes it on some level like that's significantly lower as a time and labor investment than getting a game like Skyrim and being like, okay, I'm going to have to try to just like sprint through this for the next like 100 hours and like see what I can come up with essentially,
Yep.
And
I remember there was a time that like I had thoughts of like, because I got pretty serious around the time you and I met and stuff was when I was like starting to get pretty serious about writing about video games, and I was doing it while I had a full-time job. It was like just side project. Yeah. But there was a time when I was like doing the math, like, okay, if I hustled, I could do this freelance. And sort of the conclusion I came up when I did the math is like, I could, yes, but I would be a terrible, like this is around the same time when I had my first child. I'd be a terrible husband and father. And so I just said, I think
for
I have to give
$50 an article.
Yeah. I was like, I think I have to give that up.
Rocking your kid to bed with one hand while you're like, moving around like, GTA
Killing
Los
dragons
Angeles with the other hand on your PS4 controller.
Yep. That's totally how it would be. And I think the other thing that killed it for me, any kind of dreams of doing that, was the realization that, and I don't say this in criticism of you because in any way, but I was like, I would have to do like mainstream games journalism. Like, you know what I mean? Like I'd have to, Kotaku's maybe not the right example, but I'd have to work for someplace like Kotaku or IGN. I'd have to do that kind of stuff constantly because that's where the money is. And I was interested in like the kind of stuff that Killscreen published, honestly. And also like I was really into the intersection of like faith and religion and video games and that kind of thing. I was getting a lot of like freelance jobs to write about that and stuff like that. And there's not money in that interest, except for like the occasional feature article, here or there.
Which I find super interesting, especially from like the RPG angle, because I remember like, I think it was Tom Bissell, like he kind of stands out as one of the only, and certainly one of the first people who like wrote about games and kind of achieved this sort of mainstream level of recognition for doing so.
He wrote, what was the book he wrote?
Extra Lives, I think it was called.
Extra Lives, Why Video Games Matter.
Right, and then it's hilarious.
He wrote for
like
ESPN's thing that went out of business. Grantland, yeah. He was like the first video game writer for Grantland, so he was like kind of this guy, just for our listeners who don't know who he is, kind of a very accomplished writer who wrote pretty seriously about video games. Kind of one of the first guys to do that, in addition to
granddaddy.
Things like Killscreen.
Yeah, he was very much, as you were saying, Drew, like, I think it's important to consider someone like him, which is, I think that's unfortunately kind of the reality of like the situation you're describing as well, where it's like, if you're trying to start out in writing in the first place, and you're trying to start out writing about video games, it's a very uphill battle, especially if you don't want to be working for the kind of IGN or Kotaku or GameSpot type places. Yeah. Tom Bissell, I think, had a kind of, I don't know if I'd call it like an advantage, because it's clearly something he like earned himself because he's an incredible writer, but like he had written a lot of very successful books and like short stories, and was like, he was already kind of like enmeshed in that very kind of like high-minded, prestigious literary world of like the Dave Eggers of the world, who,
yeah,
Dave Eggers was the guy who founded Grantland, right?
I think so.
Or he was like one of, yeah, like that level of writer who, Dave Eggers, like, I don't know if he's ever won the Pulitzer Prize, but I know one of his memoirs, A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And he's the kind of person who, like, his books show up on the year-end lists of like, the New Yorker or the New York Times or something. And I think because Tom Bissell had that kind of clout to him, he was able to do it in a way where he was like, hey, like, I want to write, like, he wrote this amazing profile of Cliff Bleszinski. Cliff Bleszinski's he worked for Epic Games for a very long time, and he kind of created Gears of War along with a lot of other successful things. Like, I think he created Jazz Jackrabbit too.
He's kind of like,
oh man,
he's kind of like one of the rock stars of video games, like, too.
Yeah,
he strikes me as this guy who's like really successful in the world of video games, but like still has this persona where he comes across as like cool and not just a nerd or whatever,
Oh yeah, no, and he like totally milked that with the, like, I'm gonna like drive sports cars and be a badass. And like I remember seeing him on Twitter at one point. Like he quote tweeted why am I blanking? John Carmack. John Carmack's the like, formative kind of genius level programmer who worked for id Software for a long time, helping create, Doom and Quake and everything. Yeah. And he's like one of the people who's considered kind of like a pioneer of 3D imaging technology for video game graphics. But I remember like John Carmack's Twitter was, I don't know what it's like today, but I mean, for a long time it was just him posting these like incredibly obtuse, like super technical things about like what it was like working on like this engine that he was trying to create or something. And I remember seeing Cliff Bleszinski quote tweet him, when he posted something like very, very dense and nerdy like that, and Cliff Bleszinski was like, "Oh yeah, all the time, man." And the joke was that, like, you know, Cliff was like, you know, the kind of jock guy who would in high school, like, you know, give John Carmack a wedgie or something.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But to go back to what I was saying before, so like Tom Bissell, you know, he was able to kind of start at this level where it wasn't like writing $20 video game blogs for Killscreen. Like, he wrote like a print article for the New Yorker, which probably paid him like $20,000 to $30,000 just for that single piece of writing. Which, like, you try to not make it about the sheer economics of it, but like, I started out in journalism when print was already dying, but I think like it was kind of officially at that point this thing of like, if you ever made it into print for like a magazine like the New Yorker, especially, that was like a fleeting and humongous accomplishment. And I remember like saying to so many of my different journalism friends, it's like, if you got paid like $3 to $5 a word to write something, and you're writing this, like, you know, 5,000 word article, you would work so much harder on that than you ever possibly could afford to, literally, if you're writing, you know, like a review of GTA 5 for $50 a pop or something, you know?
Yeah.
But it's actually, I've always found Tom Bissell's case interesting too, especially because of the way that, you know, once like Gamergate and this whole ethics thing started, is that like the thing about like the thing that was always self-evident about it from the beginning was that it was never actually about ethics in journalism, because like there were so many clear ethical issues that were just never touched on because they involved men rather than women, for instance. And like Tom Bissell, I want to be clear that I don't think he did anything ethically wrong, but like he wrote this profile of Cliff Bleszinski, and then he kind of leveraged that into becoming a writer for the Gears of War series. Like, he wrote several of the latest installments in Gears of War, you know?
Yeah.
And I always thought that was an interesting example because, like, one, it says something a little depressing about the nature of games journalism, which is that, like, well, games journalism, like all journalism, is just fundamentally unsustainable right now because, like, the journalism as an industry hasn't found a way to kind of successfully and substantially monetize itself for the internet yet. But then it's just so much easier on a lot of levels than if you, not easier because obviously these jobs are very rarefied and competitive and difficult to get, but if you are one of the people who can get to that level of being like a narrative designer or a narrative writer who gets kind of called in to sort of write the main story and the main dialogue for the next Gears of War title, for instance, like, you've just kind of made it, you know, like you're just kind of like, okay, like I don't know, like I had a couple friends when I was more into the game industry that worked at Ubisoft, I remember, and they would tell me in terms I honestly can't remember, but even if I did, I probably wouldn't want to specify them that much. But like, if you're one of the lead writers on a blockbuster franchise title, like an Assassin's Creed title, like you do very well for yourself, you know? Because it's the same thing as writing the screenplay for, like, you know, a blockbuster movie or something.